Graduation was supposed to be the moment everything finally made sense. The proof that all those unpaid hours, late nights, and quiet sacrifices had earned me a future in my family's business. Instead, 3 days after I walked across that stage, I opened a thin folder in my father's office and realized my future had already been given away, not to a buyer, not to a partner, to my sister. When I confronted my parents, my dad avoided my eyes. My mom didn't. She looked at me with the same calm expression she used when making final decisions and said, "Harper, you're just good with your hands, not your brain." That sentence erased years of loyalty in one breath. So I stopped working 60-hour weeks without pay. I stopped fixing problems no one else could solve. And when my dad finally called, his voice shaking, asking me to save our biggest client, I understood the truth they never planned for. They didn't give the business to my sister. They gave it away because they thought I'd always stay silent. My name is Harper Collins, and for most of my life, I thought loyalty was something you earned your place with. I grew up inside our family workshop, not as a visitor, not as a child who came by after school for fun, but as part of the machinery itself. The sounds of grinding metal and humming engines were more familiar to me than music. The smell of oil clung to my clothes so deeply that even after washing, it followed me into classrooms and later into college dorms. While other kids talked about weekends and vacations, I learned how to spot small problems before they became expensive ones. I learned how to keep my mouth shut and my hands busy. By the time I was 16, I knew the workflow better than most of the adults on the floor. Employees came to me when machines stalled or orders went wrong, even when my father was standing 10 feet away. I never questioned that. I took it as a sign that I was needed, that I mattered. My father, Richard Collins, loved to talk about legacy. He said the word often, like a promise. Legacy, family, sacrifice. He talked about how lucky we were to have something of our own, something built from the ground up. When he spoke to clients, his voice was steady and confident. When he spoke to me, it was usually about what still needed to be done. My mother, Elaine, was different. She didn't care much for the workshop itself. She cared about how it looked from the outside. Clean lines, strong branding. The right people seeing the right version of our family. She believed success was fragile and had to be managed carefully. With her, nothing was ever said directly. Expectations floated in the air, unspoken but heavy. And I learned quickly that disappointing her meant becoming invisible. Then there was my younger sister, Madison. Madison never belonged to the workshop the way I did. She passed through it like a guest. She wore clean shoes that never picked up dust. Her hands were always soft, always empty. When clients visited, she appeared effortlessly, smiling at the right moments, laughing at the right jokes. She knew how to look important without ever getting dirty. My parents watched her differently, with pride, with anticipation. When they looked at me, there was no anticipation, only assumption. I was the one who would stay late. I was the one who would handle it. I was the one who didn't need to be asked. Weekends weren't days off. They were longer shifts. Summers weren't breaks. They were proof that I was learning responsibility. Whenever I asked about pay, it was brushed aside. It's for the family. It'll come back to you. You're building something. So I stayed. I worked 60-hour weeks while balancing classes. I skipped social events. I told myself rest was for people who didn't care as much as I did. Every time a project succeeded, my parents praised the business. When something went wrong, it quietly became my problem to fix. Madison, meanwhile, was being introduced to clients as the future. She sat in meetings I wasn't invited to. She spoke in polished phrases I recognized from my mother. No one ever said I couldn't be there. I was simply never asked. Still, I believed. I believed that once I graduated, once I came back with a degree, things would change. I imagined being seen not just as useful, but as capable. I imagined sitting at the table instead of standing behind it. I imagined that all the years of quiet endurance meant something. I didn't realize that in my family, my role had already been decided and proving myself was never going to change it. For a long time, graduation was the thing that kept me going. Whenever exhaustion crept in, whenever my hands ached so badly I had to sit in my truck for a few minutes before driving home, I told myself it was temporary. Just get through this. Just finish school. Once I had the degree, once I came back with something official in my hands, things would be different. They would have to be. I didn't just study to pass. I studied to fix what I'd watched quietly break for years. I learned systems, logistics, scheduling, the kinds of structures that kept businesses from collapsing under pressure. In class, I found myself thinking about our workshop constantly. How much time we lost fixing the same problems over and over? How many delays could have been prevented if anyone bothered to step back and look at the whole picture? I wrote papers that might as well have been blueprints for our company's future. When graduation came, my parents sat in the front row. My dad clapped loudly when my name was called. My mom smiled for photos. Madison hugged me afterward and told me she was proud, her phone already angled for a picture. I thought that moment meant something. 3 days later, I was back at the workshop. Same floor, same noise, same expectations. No meeting was scheduled. No conversation happened. I wasn't asked what I'd learned or what I thought we could improve. I picked up my apron like always and went to work, waiting for the shift that never came. Instead, the workload increased. Projects stacked up, deadlines tightened, 60-hour weeks returned as if nothing had changed. Payment was still coming later. When I brought up ideas, I'd developed small adjustments at first. Careful not to sound arrogant, my dad nodded and said we'd think about it. My mom reminded me that change took time. Madison, meanwhile, started showing up more. She didn't stay long. She didn't work the floor. She drifted in around midday, smiled at clients, took photos of finished pieces, and left. Later, I'd see those photos online, captions praising vision and leadership. My parents shared every single one. The first time it really sank in was during a client issue I solved late one night. A delivery had gone wrong, and I stayed until nearly midnight fixing it. The next morning, my dad thanked Madison in front of the team for handling the situation so well. I didn't correct him. I told myself it was a mistake. I told myself recognition wasn't important. I told myself to be patient. But patience started to feel less like a virtue and more like a trap. Meetings began happening without me. Nothing dramatic, just conversations that paused when I walked in, decisions already made by the time I heard about them. Emails I used to be copied on arrived after the fact, if at all. Madison's name appeared more often in places where mine never did. I felt it before I understood it. Something was shifting, quietly and deliberately, and I was standing in the middle of it, still working, still giving, still waiting while the future I thought I'd earned was being shaped without me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That maybe exhaustion was making me sensitive. That maybe this was what growth looked like: more responsibility, less reassurance. I told myself families didn't conspire against their own. They didn't quietly push someone aside after taking everything they had to give. But the signs kept stacking up. Conversations stopped when I entered a room, then resumed later behind closed doors. Supplier calls that used to come directly to me were suddenly rerouted through the office. Client emails sat unanswered until Madison replied with carefully worded messages that sounded impressive but said very little. When problems arose, they still found their way to me, but without acknowledgement, without credit, without discussion. I started noticing how often my name didn't appear. It was in the small things first. Calendar invites that never came. Strategy discussions I heard about after decisions were finalized. Files that used to be shared openly, now labeled internal. No one told me I was excluded. I was simply no longer considered necessary to include. The night everything finally clicked, the workshop was unusually quiet. Most of the crew had left early after a large delivery, and the hum of the machines felt louder in the empty space. My dad had asked me to grab some insurance paperwork before heading out, something routine I'd done 100 times. I knew exactly where he kept the documents. As I opened the filing cabinet, a few folders slid forward. One of them stopped halfway out. A clean, typed label caught my eye. Internal planning. I told myself not to look. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the edge of the drawer, my heart beating harder than it should have. I wasn't snooping, I reasoned. I was already trusted with everything else. Whatever it was, it couldn't matter that much. I opened it anyway. At first, the words blurred. My eyes skimmed the page without understanding, the way you read something you're not emotionally prepared to process. Then certain phrases began to stand out. Ownership structure, transition timeline, leadership realignment. Madison's name appeared over and over. Mine appeared once. under a section titled Phase Out Support Role. I read it again, slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. This wasn't a draft. It wasn't a possibility. It was a plan, detailed, deliberate, already in motion. Dates? Responsibilities. A future mapped out carefully, with me placed exactly where they wanted me. Useful, silent, and temporary. The air in the room felt heavier. The lights hummed above me, suddenly too loud. I closed the folder and put it back exactly where it had been, my hands shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. That was when the truth finally settled in. I wasn't being overlooked. I wasn't being undervalued by accident. I was being erased on purpose. I went home that night and lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with my parents. Every time they told me to be patient. Every time they asked me to help just a little longer. It all lined up too neatly to ignore. By morning, something inside me had changed. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter, heavier. The belief that if I worked hard enough, I would eventually be chosen was gone. The next morning, I went back to work like nothing had happened. Same jeans, same boots, same quiet nods to the crew as I walked across the floor. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The hope that had fueled me for years, the belief that endurance would eventually be rewarded was gone. And without it, everything felt different. I didn't quit. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't raise my voice or make demands. I simply stopped carrying what was never mine to carry. When the clock hit the end of the day, I cleaned my station, turned off the light above my bench, and left. No lingering, no checking emails from my phone on the drive home. If an issue came up after hours, I documented it and set it aside for the next morning. If a delivery ran late, I forwarded the information instead of rearranging my entire schedule to fix it myself. I didn't sabotage anything. I followed the rules precisely. At first, no one noticed. The systems I'd built over years didn't collapse immediately. They stretched, they absorbed the strain the way they always had because I had designed them to. But without me constantly stepping in to smooth the edges, small inefficiencies started to show. A supplier called asking for clarification on specifications I usually handled. I directed the call to the office. A client emailed late one evening with technical questions. I replied politely the next morning and looped in management instead of answering directly. Meetings grew longer. Decisions stalled. I watched from the sidelines as problems I used to solve in minutes turned into hour-long discussions. It was uncomfortable to witness. These were people I respected, workers who'd stood beside me for years. The guilt crept in during quiet moments, tempting me to step back into my old role, to fix things before anyone felt the impact. But I reminded myself of the folder, of the plan, of the fact that the system had been built to run on my silence. If I kept cushioning the consequences, nothing would ever change. Outside the workshop, something unexpected began to happen. A supplier I'd worked with for years pulled me aside during a routine pickup. "You still planning to stay long-term?" he asked casually. When I hesitated, he nodded like he already knew the answer. "Whatever you do," he said, "you're good. People notice." A few days later, a client emailed me privately, thanking me for a recent project and asking if I'd ever consider working independently. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't ready yet. But for the first time since graduation, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my future didn't have to exist inside a place that had already decided I didn't belong. And just as that thought settled in, my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. My father didn't usually call me directly during work hours, so when his name lit up my phone, I knew something was wrong. "Harper," he said the moment I answered. His voice was tight, controlled but strained. "We have a situation." I leaned against my truck, the engine still off, watching dust drift through the open workshop doors. For years, that sound, the low hum of machines, the scrape of tools, had felt like home. "What kind of situation?" I asked. "Our biggest client has concerns," he said. "They're asking questions. Technical ones. Things only you usually handle." I waited. "They specifically asked for you," he added quietly. For a moment I said nothing. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was listening to the way his voice changed when he needed something from me, to the panic he tried, and failed, to hide. "I've documented everything," I said finally. It's all in the shared system. There was a pause. Then a sharp exhale. They don't want documents, my dad said. They want reassurance. Reassurance. The word almost made me laugh. I'll call you back, I said, and ended the call before he could say more. That evening was our regular family dinner. Same house I grew up in. Same table polished until it reflected the warm overhead lights. Normally, I arrived early to help. That night, I showed up exactly on time. My mom, Elaine, was arranging plates when I walked in. She glanced up, smiled briefly, then looked back down, adjusting a napkin that didn't need adjusting. My sister, Madison, arrived next, perfectly put together, phone already in her hand. My dad followed, carrying a bottle of wine like nothing in the world was wrong. We sat. There was small talk. Madison mentioned a recent post that had done well. My mom nodded approvingly. My dad commented on the weather. It all felt rehearsed, like a scene they'd practiced without me. I reached into my bag and placed a slim folder in the center of the table. No one touched it. "What's that?" my dad asked. "You know what it is," I said. My mom's hand stilled. Madison's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her phone. I opened it to the page I'd memorized and slid it closer to them. "I found this by accident," I said evenly. "But it explains a lot." My dad leaned forward, reading. His jaw tightened. My mom didn't look at the page. She looked at me. "This is business planning," she said calmly. "You weren't meant to see it yet." "Yet?" I repeated. "So there was a time you planned to tell me I was being phased out?" Madison finally looked up. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone light, almost bored. "It's just structure." "Structure that gives you everything," I said, turning to her, "and gives me nothing." My dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. My mom sighed, a sound heavy with practiced disappointment. "Harper," she said, "you've always been good with your hands. That's your strength. But leadership takes a different kind of mind." There it was. The sentence I'd heard in pieces my entire life, finally said without softening. "You mean I'm useful," I said slowly, "but not worthy." "That's not what I said," my dad cut in quickly. "It's exactly what you said," I replied. "Just spread out over years." The table fell silent. Then my dad's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and stood up. "I need to take this." He stepped away, his voice dropping as he answered. I watched his shoulders tense, watched the color drain from his face. When he came back, the bottle of wine forgotten on the counter, his expression was different. "It's the client," he said. "They're not comfortable proceeding." Madison scoffed. "They're bluffing." "They're not," my dad snapped, then caught himself. He turned to me. "They're asking for you. They said if you're not involved, they're reconsidering." I met his eyes. "I told you everything you need is documented." "They don't want documents," he said. "They want the person they trust." My mom looked between us, confusion flickering across her face. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said quietly, "the relationship was with me. Not the brand, not the image. Me." Madison laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "That's ridiculous." "They work with who delivers," I replied. "Who answers their calls at night? Who fixes things before they become problems?" My dad rubbed his forehead. "Harper, we need you to step in. Just this once." The irony almost made me smile. "And after I fix this?" I asked. "Do I go back to being phased out?" "We can revisit things," he said weakly. My mom leaned forward. "You're being selfish. This affects all of us." "No," I said calmly. "This affects the system you built." Another buzz. My dad checked his phone again. His hand shook. "They're pulling out," he said, effective immediately. Madison stood up. "That's impossible." "They sent notice," he replied. "They're done." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My dad looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and far too late. "You could stop this," he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I couldn't, not anymore." The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was final. I didn't leave that house angry. That surprised even me. I gathered the folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood up slowly. My dad reached out like he wanted to stop me, then hesitated, his hand hovering in the air before dropping back to his side. No one followed me to the door. No one apologized. No one tried to explain. That silence told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I didn't show up to the workshop. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down every responsibility I had quietly absorbed over the years: client relationships, technical oversight, emergency fixes, after-hours problem-solving. The list was longer than I expected. Seeing it laid out in ink made my chest tighten, not with pride, but with clarity. By noon, my phone started ringing. First my dad, then my mom, then Madison. I let every call go to voicemail. When I finally responded, it wasn't with emotion. It was with structure. I sent a short email, professional and calm. I explained that, effective immediately, I would no longer be providing unpaid labor, informal consulting, or emergency support. Any future involvement would require a written agreement outlining compensation, authority, and scope of responsibility. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just boundaries. My mom replied first. She said I was being cold, that I was tearing the family apart, that I was choosing money over loyalty. I didn't argue. I forwarded her response to my attorney. Because here was the truth I'd avoided for years. Loyalty without protection isn't love. It's exposure. And I had been exposed for a long time. Over the next few days, the consequences spread. Suppliers began asking for confirmations no one could give. Clients requested meetings that kept getting postponed. Internal emails grew longer, more frantic. The system I'd quietly supported didn't collapse all at once. It stalled, strained, and started to show exactly how dependent it had been on someone they refused to acknowledge. My dad called again, this time calmer, more measured. "Let's talk," he said. "We can figure something out." "We can," I agreed. "Through lawyers." That ended the call. I finished documenting everything I'd already committed to cleanly, carefully, responsibly. I didn't leave chaos behind. I left clarity, and when my final handoff was complete, I stepped away without slamming doors or burning bridges, just closing one. For the first time since graduation, my days were quiet, unsettling at first, then peaceful. I slept through the night. I ate meals without checking my phone. I felt my shoulders drop from around my ears, the tension slowly draining out of a body that had been braced for years. I didn't win anything from my family, but I reclaimed something far more important: my time, my agency, and the right to decide what I would and would no longer give away for free. The quiet didn't last forever. About a week after I stepped away completely, an email came in from a name I recognized but had never spoken to outside of work. Laura Bennett, someone I'd only dealt with professionally, someone who had watched how I handled problems without ever knowing the full story behind them. She didn't ask about my family. She didn't ask about the fallout. She asked about my availability. We met for coffee on a Tuesday morning. No workshop noise, no urgency, no expectations that I would prove my loyalty before being taken seriously. She listened while I explained what I did, how I thought, how I approached systems that were already under strain. When I finished, she nodded once and said something so simple it almost caught me off guard. "That's exactly what we need." The terms were clear. Fair pay. Defined authority. Real boundaries. No late-night emergencies disguised as favors. No vague promises about someday. Everything was written down. Everything was respected. For the first time in my adult life, my calendar felt like it belonged to me. I didn't wake up with dread in my chest. I didn't feel guilty for leaving work on time. I noticed things I hadn't noticed in years: how quiet mornings could be, how food tasted better when eaten slowly, how my body felt when it wasn't constantly bracing for the next crisis. My phone rang less often. When it did, I chose whether to answer. My parents still reached out, their messages circling the truth without ever landing on it. My dad talked about regret without naming it. My mom talked about family without acknowledging damage. Madison posted more than ever confident captions, polished images, but something about them felt thinner now, louder, like reassurance meant for herself. I didn't respond, not out of spite, out of clarity. I realized I didn't need their recognition to validate what I already knew. I had built value quietly for years. I had survived being overlooked, minimized, and underestimated. And now, I was finally in a place where none of that defined me. I wasn't starting over. I was starting free. I used to believe that being needed was the same as being valued. That if I just worked harder, stayed longer, sacrificed more, eventually someone would look at me and say, "You belong here." I built my entire sense of worth around that idea, even when it kept costing me sleep, peace, and dignity. Walking away forced me to see the truth. I wasn't leaving because I was weak. I was leaving because I finally understood my value. My family didn't collapse overnight. They adjusted. Slowly. Painfully. In ways I no longer felt responsible for managing. Some days, the guilt still tried to creep back in, but it didn't last. I reminded myself that protecting myself wasn't betrayal. It was survival. And survival, I learned, can be quiet. No shouting. No revenge. Just the steady decision to stop giving yourself away to people who confuse access with entitlement. Today, my work is respected, my time is protected, and my future no longer depends on whether someone else decides to choose me. If this story sounds familiar, if you've ever been told you were useful but not worthy, remember this. You don't need permission to leave a place that keeps hurting you. You don't owe loyalty to a system built on your silence. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't staying. It's choosing yourself and walking forward without looking back.